Namaskar. The National Institution for Transforming India completes 1 year. It came into existence on the 1st of January 2015, the brainchild of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. It replaced the erstwhile Planning Commission, which had served its time, and the National Institution for Transforming India has brought in a new relationship between the center and the states, cooperative federalism or competitive federalism. And to tell us how the Niti Aayog has evolved over the 1 year and the road ahead, we are very privileged to have with us the Vice Chairperson of Niti Aayog, Dr. Arvind Panagariya. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us.
Pleasure to be here.
First of all, let's talk about how this fulfills the mandate of Prime Minister Narendra Modi when he felt that the Planning Commission needed to be changed. Niti Aayog now has basically changed the way we think, has changed the mindscape of the government.
Certainly. So this was, a shared sentiment. In fact, when the former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh gave his what became his farewell address to the institution on 30th April 2014, he had also expressed a sentiment that, look, are we still working with institutions and instruments that were meant for yesterday. And I think Prime Minister Modi then gave expression to that sentiment by announcing on 15th of August 2014 his intention to replace Planning Commission by a new institution. And then, of course, on January 1, 2015, he announced the formation of the Niti Aayog, or the National Institution for Transforming India.
Right, but when you did start, you had you had an excess of staff, perhaps, from the Planning Commission. You had to streamline a little bit because the government has come in with the principle of maximum governance through minimum government. And through that, how did you manage, sir?
So let me give a little bit more background, then I come to the issue that you have raised. Also the underlying philosophy was that, look, with the 1991 reforms, we had moved largely to a market economy. So whereas prior to that we had investment licensing, we had import licensing, we also used to have distribution controls, price controls. So through this kind of institutional setup, the government was capable of actually guiding, almost controlling even the private economy. So, how many cars will be produced, how many scooters will be produced, that's a decision the government made through licensing. And then, of course, through distribution controls, it also decided who's going to get the scooter at what price, or who's going to get the car at what price, etc. So then you could plan the private economy as also, well, public economy, of course, public sector you can always plan, because the government has the wherewithal to guide the public investments and public expenditures. But private economy, after the 1991 reforms, really, in effect, we really could no longer quite plan in the way we could at the time of various controls that existed. So that was the thinking that, look, now we are pretty much fully into the free market economy. We had also opened up trade. So there was no import licensing anymore on imports. And so that was a philosophy that led then ultimately to led the Prime Minister to take the action. Now, of course, when I came, we naturally inherited the staff from the Planning Commission. Prime Minister had this very clear commitment that he did not want anybody losing their jobs. And so that had to be kept in mind as well. And clearly, so we were to reorient the institution with the staff we had inherited. But we also felt that, to the extent that the staff was from different cadres, not the Planning Commission cadre, but the Indian Economic Services cadres or other cadres, they do have a home elsewhere. And they can be sent to the cadre. So we actually then had a committee which looked after reorganization and restructuring, and as a part of that, we had about 1,250 posts here, of which about 800 were occupied We have brought that number down to 500. So we now have only 500 positions. And in that process, then we have to also restructure the institution itself. So we divided now to suit the new mandates of the Niti Aayog. So we have now divided the institution into two hubs. One is called the Knowledge and Innovation Hub, and the other is called the Team India Hub. Right. Team India Hub kind of interfaces with the states to give a concrete shape to our cooperative federalism mandate, and the Knowledge and Innovation Hub has several verticals, which each of which deals with a sector. So you got trade and macro, you got health, you got education, and so forth. So infrastructure, etc. So and of course the two hubs have to interface with each other. They can't remain in silos because states' needs relate to sectors, and therefore this Team India Hub has to very closely work with the innovation, the Knowledge and Innovation Hub.
So let's take the Team India Hub, sir. How much representation now is there for the states in the new thinking, and how effective what is this interface? How do the states actually deal with this, with the institution?
So in effect, a joint secretary level officer is assigned the state. So every state therefore has an officer here who is joint secretary level, and if states have issues, they can call this officer, and then the officer then connects them back to the experts, relevant experts in the specific sectors in which the state has the need. So that's how the Team India Hub basically is to function. Knowledge and Innovation Hub has to develop expertise in the sector which is assigned to it. It has to also become the repository of knowledge in that sector, the best practices in that sector, and of course, if the states reach out, then they provide the expertise. There's also the mandate that we learn about the best practices, we document about the best practices in each of the sectors, and then inform all the other states about it. So if Andhra Pradesh is doing well in certain initiatives, can those initiatives be brought fruitfully to the other states? So that's part of our cooperative federalism.
And well, when the government took office, the world economy was going through some bad times, and we managed to withstand a lot of this, and we are now growing at 7.4%. You say that we could grow by 8%. Why is all this happening? How is this happening actually, sir?
Well, many of the policy actions were taken by the government. When the government came, as we all remember, the morale was very low in almost every sector, and a lot of it had been driven by the paralysis that had existed in the central government in terms of the environmental clearances, in terms of the top bureaucrats taking decisions, in terms of interministerial disputes which were then not resolved by either an empowered group of ministers or by the PMO. So the present government, the Prime Minister came in, and one of the very first things he did was to put an end to that paralysis. Decisions began to happen. That's clearly was one of the major contributors, but also the general tenor of the government has been more towards reforms. In areas so the Prime Minister has tried to also end the Inspector Raj by creating this Shram Suvidha portal. Also he moved on with some further liberalization of foreign investment. The 15-16 budget announced that we'll have a new state-of-the-art bankruptcy law. So there is a whole series of initiatives the government has taken which are meant to be pro-growth, growth-oriented, and that's bearing fruits. We still have some ways to go. There is some fragility in some of the markets, but I think we are getting there.
Are you happy, sir, with the type of job creation that is taking place in industry and in services, and perhaps with some of the new innovative ideas that will be coming up to try and create jobs in our country?
I'm very happy with the efforts we are making, but we have to remember that in India, the need for jobs is so enormous. Absolutely. that at no stage can we say that, yeah, I'm really very happy and I can now sit back and relax. I think particularly good jobs, jobs where people actually have employment for the full year and at reasonable wages commensurate with their skill levels. That's a big challenge, continuing challenge, and we have to keep at it, but we are certainly making progress.
And with regard to Atal Innovation Mission, now the Niti Aayog had set up a committee which submitted a report on innovation, come up with some interesting ideas, a grand challenge idea for one. How are these things going to be, implemented, or how will the government take these suggestions? Yes.
So again, this was the initiative of the government. Prime Minister himself wanted it, and the Finance Minister. So in the budget, they provided for the Atal Innovation Mission and the self-employment talent utilization called SETU. And both of these programs were actually given to Niti Aayog. So we then thought that we needed to do some groundwork before we start spending real money. And so we appointed the committee under Tarun Khanna, who is a professor at Harvard, and we really had a very high-powered committee. They've submitted a very good report. Now we are proceeding to implement the recommendations, some of the recommendations at least, and as we go. Grand challenge is one of the components. Then there are the incubators where we have work to do. I think those will be done by the ministries largely. And there are also issues of ecosystem for the startups. So how to first step is to have innovation, second step is to convert innovation into entrepreneurship, and we have to work on all those fronts, and we will be doing it in 2016.
Right, so and also with regard to ease of doing business, that's another important aspect, and we have been trying to make changes in the way India is perceived in terms of a place for investment. And you all have studied 3,500 firms, have come up with a survey. What have we understood from all this?
So the survey is still underway. So what we had felt was that the initial analysis that was done by the Department of Industrial Policy and Programs, the DIP, was based on interviews with the government officials in the states. So there was a whole elaborate set of measures that the DIP had suggested, this advised that the states implement those, and they went through an implementation phase, and then DIP basically did a survey of the officials asking whether they had actually implemented each of these measures. And based on that, then they ranked the states, and Gujarat was ranked number 1 and Andhra Pradesh was ranked number 2, etc. Our view was that in the end we would learn a lot more, and perhaps we'll get a better sense of how well the implementation has been done, because we can't simply go by the word of the officials themselves, because there can be in principle a certain bias to say that yes, we have implemented the measures even though the implementation may have been only halfway. It is only the firms or enterprises that are impacted by those measures who are in a better position to actually judge and assess whether the implementation was successful or not. So we therefore felt that we ought to go ahead and do a survey of the enterprises themselves. So this is where we are surveying about 3,500 enterprises countrywide, and we would then produce an analysis of state-wise analysis of how well these changes are working.
So you also inherited the 12th five-year plan, and you've done a mid-year appraisal of that, a mid-term appraisal of it. What's to be done now with all this? That was the old system, and now there's a new system, and you did say earlier in one of your answers that planning is unnecessary. So what kind of, if the country is used to a particular model, is it going to be difficult to change it over time? So
now we, when I arrived here, this issue was discussed. 12th five-year plan was already in its finishing its 3rd year, and we were to go into 4th and then the 5th year. So there are 2 years 2 full years left. So the Prime Minister's decision was that for now we ought to complete the 12th five-year plan and use these 2 years as transition years. And so that's where the mandate came for the midterm appraisal of the 12th five-year plan also, which we are not nearly complete. We are seeking guidance from the Prime Minister's office to see, what the next steps ought to be. And yeah, I mean, what I said earlier was that, look, given the fact that
we are in a market economy,
that we are in a market economy, the private economy at least is now much harder to plan in the way we used to plan it. So in any case, ultimately the decision will have to be the Prime Minister's. He will take the call as to whether there should be a 13th five-year plan or not. We have to wait and see there what decision he makes on that.
And with regard to the speed of our growth and in terms of public expenditure, you're also very clear that we should continue with keeping our roadmap for fiscal consolidation. And could you expand on why that is necessary, actually, sir?
No, I think, in the end, credibility of the government is very important. And this has been a bit of a weakness in the past. Investors like to see a stable regime, and also from the viewpoint of combating inflation, it is important that the government is credible, because if the government is not credible, markets will not trust you, and then in effect both the investors as well as investors will be hesitant, and inflation will not come under control. I think it also makes the life of the RBI governor harder if the government is not predictable. So that's one set of reasons why credibility is important. Therefore, we should stay with the fiscal consolidation plan. But also, I think fiscal consolidation is important from the viewpoint of the private investment. That if the government goes to town with its expenditures, raising, let's say, fiscal deficit to 5%, it is going to crowd out the private investors, because it will then pick up a lot more money from the market, and therefore less will be left for the private investors to invest. So one of the, so we also, while we are trying to stabilize growth rates and accelerate growth rate through public investment, through increased public investment, we also need the private investment to pick up. So one has to walk a thin line to balance the two out.
So one of the biggest problems with setting up companies in our country is that they've had difficulty raising finance. Have you seen enough change taking place, maybe banking reforms, or maybe just giving confidence to people that perhaps even failure, for startups is not such a bad thing, and you can try again?
Well, I think, from the aggregate investment point of view, private investment particularly, we are still a bit behind on banking, cleaning up the bank books. The government really inherited a very fragile banking system. The past government actually left very vast volumes of stressed assets in the public sector units. I think the past government was not vigilant enough, as a result of which not only NPAs piled up, but also a lot of the restructured loans are stressed loans. And that, of course, makes the availability of funds with the banks for future loans and credits scarce. And so it does therefore impact then how much money they can loan out, the credit expansion. And credit expansion has been slow. Now there are two views here right now, that that there is also weak demand for credit by the corporations. Partly that may be true, but I think it's also an issue of
interest rates,
of the availability, and of course interest rates too. Interest rates too, because remember that the inflation went down by about 6-7 percentage points, and nominal interest rate has moved only 1.5 percentage points. So which still leaves the real interest rate a bit high. So there's that issue also. But so we need the action on the interest rate, but we also need simultaneously we have to perhaps go a little more boldly to clean up the problem that the government inherited from the previous government, namely cleaning up the bank books.
So on the global front, you have been a Sherpa at the G20. Now, what kind of role is India playing in terms of as an emerging power, in terms of economy, and how do we get our national interests, in all these big negotiations, whether it be on climate change or the WTO? You played a significant part in, in stressing India's role.
Yes. So I now am leading the G20 negotiations on behalf of India, and our Prime Minister's mandate is very clear that while on the one hand he expects us to defend the national interest in these negotiations, he also feels that we should not do it in a way that we look like the only ones, meaning, he doesn't want us to be isolated in these negotiations, and that is the careful walk then the negotiator has to do. So far I have good luck. I did the negotiation in Antalya for the latest G20 leaders communique, and we had tough negotiations, particularly on the climate change paragraph, but I was pleased that I was able to negotiate in a way that did not undermine the negotiating ability of the actual team in Paris subsequently on climate change, and the same for Nairobi. So we clearly, for the trade negotiations. So in both of those cases, I needed to ensure that the actual negotiation takes place where it is supposed to take place. And in the developed countries, some of the countries were trying to push the negotiation in the G20 in a direction in which hopefully they could accomplish some of their goals of Paris and Nairobi in Antalya. And so that was the careful walk I had to do.
So Niti Aayog is 1 year old. It's still an evolving institution. And what do you see, sir, as the road ahead, and what do you plan for it, as you're after all crafting its future?
Yes, I think we have to keep working hard. We have had some good work done in the first year, and we have written a blog today about it on the Niti Aayog website. But there is much more to be done. The institution needs to be reshaped continuously, and in 2016 in particular, I think I want to see that we can make much greater progress on the think tank function of the institution. So you would see us, engaging much more in the knowledge activities in 2016 in different areas that we cover. We would like to collaborate with the outside scholars, both within India and outside India. We would also try to create the stock of knowledge here, a repository of knowledge, best practices, and all. So that is going to be one of our big kind of efforts going into 2016.
Sure, sir. And these ideas, so they're all going to be available obviously to the states as best practices, but we have such a diversity of states. Some are so huge, some have different problems and challenges. Isn't each state unique in its own way? And perhaps let's take the states of the Northeast, for instance, will have different issues, isn't it, sir?
They certainly, so certainly there are some issues which are specific to some states, but then there is also some commonality. Everybody needs education, everybody needs health. Most of our states do farming, so there are issues of agricultural markets that apply to all states. So there is a very substantial chunk which is common, and where the lessons learned in one state can actually be applied to the other states. So that commonality. So we do both ways. We work both ways. You're absolutely right that we also have to pay special attention, to pay attention to the special problems of a specific set of or group of states. as in particular the northeastern states. So we do pay actually very special attention to the problems of those states, which need not apply to the other states.
So one final question. You did mention about agricultural marketing and remunerative prices to farmers is one issue. How have you all been dealing with this kind of an issue?
So again, this is going to be going into 2016. This is going to be. We hope that we would be able to make some progress in the next year in bringing more lucrative prices to the farmers. This is a complicated question because we also ourselves need to learn that what would work, what would not work. But certainly, in the supply chain, there are certain ideas some of which we have articulated actually in this occasional paper that has appeared based on the work of the task force on agricultural development that had been appointed under my chairmanship, and so we would be trying out some of these ideas as we go forward, and there are a lot of other reforms also that are underway already in the states themselves. So I visited in the last, just in last 2 weeks, I visited Andhra Pradesh and I visited Rajasthan. Both of those states really have now, and I've also met actually the officer who did the marketing, agricultural marketing, e-marketing in Karnataka. So at least 3 states I know, they have actually made good progress in agricultural marketing. So they do e-auctions within each mandi. And then the next step will be to connect all the mandis within the state and hopefully then connecting the mandis across the nation. So that's one of the things that is underway. Hopefully that will make progress. But there are other things that also need to be done, particularly in terms of giving rights to the farmers, as well as providing means to the farmers to sell their produce to multiple possible buyers. Because that's what creates competition. Under the current system in most states, actually, the farmer is captive to selling his or her produce to a specific one entity, and that, of course, means lower price for the farmer.
Dr. Arvind Panagariya, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with DD News.
My pleasure.